Leave with the end of that hymn, "Fear not, I will pilot you." Imagine for a moment that you are there on a storm-tossed boat on the Sea of Galilee. It is dark and the waves are tossing you about, and you are afraid, more afraid than you have ever been in your life. That's what those first disciples were experiencing. But it's not all that different than the kinds of stormy days that we sometimes have and that catch us off balance and toss us about in ways that we never anticipated, expected, or prepared for. As I sat in the sanctuary here this past Tuesday evening and listened as Kyle Brzezowski offered a spectacular recital on piano and organ, it occurred to me, and I was doing a little sermon thought preparation, that it was possible to paint with music an image of a storm. I've lost Jeanette at the organ. Can you paint some storm music for me? But equally, one can use music to convey the calm and peace that Jesus spoke into the midst of that unsettled and stormy voyage. Thank you, Jeanette. We sort of talked about this and then we didn't. So I appreciate her ad-libbing at the organ for me. But I wanted to lift up the way in which music also adds to that sense we have in worship. By way of biblical background, the Sea of Galilee, really an interior lake, was known for having bad storms that could come up unexpectedly. It nestles kind of among hills, and rough storms often came with little warning. And that particular evening, everyone was tired. It had been a busy day. Crowds had been pressing in upon them, as they often did, to hear Jesus teach and to come close to experience his healing touch or his healing power. And to top it off, Jesus had suggested not that they go away on a restful retreat or a vacation, but that they cross over the sea to the other side, to the territory of the Gentiles, to the foreigners, to carry out into the world a message of healing and hope. And it is in that context that this storm arises, and the waves crash into the sides of the boat. The boat begins to fill with water. At least 4 of the disciples, who were themselves seasoned professional fishermen, even they were scared. And they were even more concerned that Jesus seemed to be totally oblivious to the storm that had engulfed them. In fact, he was asleep in the stern of the boat. Until, of course, up with their cry, "Teacher, don't you care if we die?" And what did Jesus do? Of course, he cared. But he spoke a word of calm in the midst of that stormy sea. He spoke the words, "Peace, be still." And the winds and the waves and the storm-tossed boat calmed. It is a powerful, if short, story. But we might ask, what does this story mean? How did it speak to the first century Christian community who heard it first, and how does it continue to speak to us? Biblical scholars have suggested that Mark was writing for a church community that must have very much felt like the crew on a storm-tossed ship. facing relentless Roman persecution and feeling very small against powerful and unfriendly forces. In some ways, feeling like David facing the giant Goliath. Only David came with a confidence and a faith that God was with him in the midst of that struggle, in the midst of that challenge and battle. The disciples here are a little less certain, a bit shaky. But the story tells us that Christ, present in the boat, stills even the storms of life. And that must have been for them, and it is for us, a very reassuring message that we are not alone in the boat. It's interesting, the word nave, which in church architecture is used to describe the main portion of a church from the narthex to the chancel, the area where the people gather for worship, really comes from the Latin word for boat. That, in a sense, here in this sanctuary, in this church, in this space, we are in the boat of the church. And it's quite clear that we're in the boat together, although I would have to step down a little bit in order to join you folks completely in the boat, because I'm kind of on the edge of the chancel. But the reality is, although it seems quite peaceful here, we know that even in this boat, on this day, there are storms. There are difficulties that people are facing into. There are journeys people would prefer not to be on. There are places that we are uncertain where they're headed. And sometimes in lives, those storms are enormous, and they preoccupy us, and they make us as fearful as those disciples who were in the boat that night. But there's something to be said for what it is that the Christian community offers to us and for us. It offers community first and foremost. It offers a body of Christ in this place, people who take on the responsibility to be Christ's hands and feet and hearts for one another. I know what it's like in a moment's time, with a simple diagnosis, to have one's life turned upside down, and to know that one is heading into some very rough water. It's been a year now since I had my breast cancer surgery, and this coming week will be the first anniversary of beginning what has been a year-long treatment protocol with chemo and radiation and lots of ups and downs. But I also know that I haven't been in that boat alone, that I have been supported and sustained and cared for, lifted up in the prayers of this congregation, and offered gifts of tender love and simple things that have made a day brighter simply because someone else has reached out in a caring way. Those things matter. And I also know that Christ is there also in the midst of that storm, in the places of our deep needs. We are in the boat because God is present there as well. The Presbyterian writer and preacher Frederick Buechner, in his collection of sermons titled Secrets in the Dark, A Life in Sermons, has written a sermon on this text, and he ends it with these words, reassuring us that Jesus will be with